In the early 70s, the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, known as the Cold War, began to ease. President Richard Nixon announced a new U.S. foreign policy that included a willingness to negotiate with communist nations about strategic arms and other important issues. A series of meetings called the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks took place between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in the 70s. These talks, held in Helsinki and Vienna, led to an agreement governing each country's production and distribution of nuclear weapons. President Nixon had many foreign policy successes. He was the first U.S. president to visit both the USSR and China, making great progress toward normalizing relations with the world's two largest communist countries. Nixon met with Mao Zedong in Beijing, heralding a new era in international politics. But as Nixon's foreign policy success grew, so did the country's domestic problems. The U.S. inflation rate hit double-digit levels, reaching as high as 12%. Unemployment jumped at the same time, reaching 6%. The U.S. government was spending huge amounts of money on the Vietnam War and the space program. But Nixon believed that America's leadership in space should continue. In 1972, he approved the new Space Shuttle project. Despite America's deepening economic problems, said to be the worst since the 1930s, Nixon's popularity remained high. The U.S. voters re-elected him president in 1972. In 1973, the last American troops left Vietnam, ending U.S. involvement there. The expensive, unpopular conflict had cost $164 billion and had claimed 58,000 American lives. Nixon's second term was marked by scandal and shame. A group of Nixon supporters were arrested for breaking into the Watergate building headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. They had installed equipment to spy on the Democratic campaign for the 1972 presidential election. Nixon claimed to have no knowledge of the conspiracy, but tape-recorded phone conversations proved that he was involved in a cover-up. In August of 1974, unable to deny the charges any longer, Nixon resigned from the presidency in disgrace. Vice President Gerald Ford was sworn in as his successor. Ford carried out much of the foreign policy work begun by Nixon. In his first few months as president, Ford met with the leaders of Japan, South Korea, and the Soviet Union. Ford and Soviet Premier Brezhnev signed the landmark SALT Agreement, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. In 1975, Ford met with Communist Party leader Brezhnev and 33 heads of state in Helsinki, Finland, where they signed an agreement to respect national borders, freedom of movement, and human rights. In the mid-70s, improved relations between the United States and the Soviet Union led to a joint mission in space. In July of 1975, the American spacecraft Apollo met the Soviet spacecraft Soyuz in a joint orbit around the Earth. They remained in orbit for a week while their crews worked together on projects and experiments. As they had agreed in advance, the American astronauts spoke only Russian during the mission, and the Soviet cosmonauts spoke only English. President Ford was defeated in the 1976 election by Jimmy Carter, the Democratic Party's nominee. President Carter began his term on an optimistic note, in spite of the fact that he had inherited many serious national problems: inflation, unemployment, and declining national productivity. Like Nixon and Ford, Carter made many strides in U.S. foreign policy. After months of talks in 1978, he persuaded the Senate to ratify the Panama Canal Treaty, promising withdrawal of U.S. control from the Canal Zone by the year 2000. President Carter realized his greatest diplomatic achievement in 1978, when Prime Minister Begin of Israel and President Sadat of Egypt met with him at Camp David and signed a Middle East peace treaty between their nations. Carter achieved another milestone in 1979 when the United States established full diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union for the first time since before World War II. But upheaval in the Middle East still threatened world peace. In early 1979, the government of Iran was overthrown and replaced by an anti-Western regime. The Muslim leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, declared the nation an Islamic republic. In November, a riotous crowd invaded the American embassy in Tehran and took 53 American diplomats hostage. They demanded the return of the deposed Shah of Iran, along with his wealth, in exchange for the Americans' release. Near the end of 1979, U.S. relations with Moscow began to sour when Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan. In response to the Soviet act of aggression, President Carter placed an embargo on U.S. grain sales to Russia and organized a boycott of the 1980 Olympic Games in Moscow. Months of diplomatic efforts failed to bring the release of the American hostages in Iran. A rescue mission by the American military failed to bring them home. Carter's public image suffered greatly, and he lost the 1980 election. The hostage crisis ended after 444 days, just as Carter's presidential successor was about to be inaugurated in 1981. Ronald Reagan had won the election by an overwhelming majority of votes.
It's not my intention to do away with government.
Reagan was a popular and stylish president who inspired confidence in many Americans. But others disliked him. Only months after his inauguration, a would-be assassin shot Reagan, his press secretary, and two others outside a hotel in Washington. Reagan fully recovered from his wound. President Reagan developed a foreign policy based on the popular belief that most international problems were caused by Soviet interference in other governments. He was quick to send U.S. troops to conflicts around the globe as a counterbalance to Soviet military power. In 1982, when Argentina invaded the British-governed Falkland Islands, Reagan offered American military assistance to the British troops dispatched there. In 1983, as a war raged through southern Lebanon, Reagan ordered 2,000 U.S. Marines to enter Beirut as a peacekeeping force. When a bomb exploded outside the Beirut Marine headquarters, killing 241 people and wounding 71, Reagan ordered the Marines to withdraw from the city. 2 days after the Beirut disaster, American troops were landing on the tiny Caribbean island of Grenada, where the government was in upheaval. Communist officials harshly criticized these actions taken during Reagan's presidency. They said the United States was trying to dominate the world. Reagan's administration was less inclined to diplomacy than previous presidents had been. Reagan opposed socialist governments worldwide, despite complaints from other world leaders. America put on an extraordinary show for the world when Los Angeles hosted the 1984 Olympic Games. Although the Games were boycotted by the USSR and several other communist countries, the spectacular Los Angeles event was praised as a model of creativity and efficiency. The mid-1980s were boom years for the U.S., and many Americans credited President Reagan with their good fortune. As the economy grew by leaps and bounds, they barely noticed their government's involvement in military conflicts around the world. Reagan's popularity soared, and he was easily re-elected in 1984. In his 1985 State of the Union address, the president discussed his principles, which became known as the Reagan Doctrine. He said that he would continue to oppose communism and Soviet aggression throughout the world. But a new Soviet leader would soon extend a hand to the U.S. in a way that was destined to change the world. Mikhail Gorbachev met with President Reagan in November of 1985. Amazingly, he agreed that democracy should be restored to the USSR and to all other communist countries. Gorbachev knew the Soviets could benefit from better relations with the U.S., which had achieved greater military and technological progress. The space shuttle was still relatively new in the mid-80s. These spacecraft had been used on several successful Earth orbits and always generated public interest. In January of 1986, the country's first civilian astronaut, schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe, was part of the 7-person crew on the space shuttle Challenger. 73 seconds after launch, the Challenger exploded in midair. All aboard were killed. Investigations revealed that a combination of freezing weather, faulty parts, and negligence had caused the explosion. The 1980s brought the spread of frightening new diseases, in particular, the spread of AIDS. By 1987, almost 1.5 million Americans had become infected with HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus, the virus that causes AIDS. In December of 1987, Soviet Premier Gorbachev returned to Washington to meet with President Reagan. The two leaders signed a treaty to eliminate strategic nuclear arms. This historic event paved the way for a lasting peace. The USSR now encouraged other communist countries to establish relations with the West. In their most significant gesture of goodwill, the Soviets withdrew 115,000 troops from Afghanistan. Since Reagan had served 2 terms as president, he could not run for election again. His vice president, George Bush, was selected as the Republican candidate and won the presidential election of 1988.
Faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
1989 was marked by man-made and natural disasters. In March, the oil tanker Exxon Valdez leaked 20 million gallons of oil into the ocean off the coast of Alaska. This ecological disaster focused the world's attention on preventing pollution and protecting the environment. In October, a 6.9 magnitude earthquake shook the San Francisco area, killing 60 and injuring 3,000. As the 90s began, the Cold War ended. President Bush and Premier Gorbachev made it official at their 1990 meeting in Washington. They signed a treaty outlining plans to reduce nuclear arms and long-range missiles. Just as the two superpowers reached a lasting agreement for peace, clouds of war gathered in the Middle East. In August of 1990, Iraqi troops invaded the neighboring country of Kuwait. 5 days later, the U.S. began landing troops in the region to prevent Iraq conquering any more land. Several other countries sent troops to support the U.S. in an effort that was dubbed Operation Desert Shield. The United Nations authorized its forces to shoot, if necessary, to prevent Iraq breaking through the blockade. When the United Nations issued an ultimatum ordering the Iraqis out of Kuwait, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein declared the country would wage war rather than retreat. In January 1991, when the United Nations ultimatum expired, American and Allied planes bombed every strategic bridge in Iraq. In late February, American and Allied ground forces attacked Iraqi forces in an effort known as Operation Desert Storm. After 5 days of fighting, the Allies forced the Iraqi army to retreat. Kuwait was liberated, and the fighting stopped. The whole world breathed a sigh of relief. In March of 1991, police in Los Angeles beat Rodney King, a motorist they had stopped for a traffic violation. Public emotions were tense when the officers were brought to trial in 1992. When the jury acquitted them, public reaction to the verdict exploded into the streets. Some residents of the city violently expressed their anger through rioting, looting, arson, and assault. When local law enforcement could not subdue the violence, President Bush sent U.S. Marines to restore order. The summer of 1992 brought a devastating hurricane to the east and Gulf coasts. Hurricane Andrew ripped across South Florida and then blasted southern Louisiana. With winds gusting to more than 150 miles per hour, it became the costliest hurricane in American history. The United States has always tried to help victims of misfortune, both at home and abroad. This has included sending armed forces to support United Nations peacekeepers around the world. In 1992, the UN Security Council approved a military mission to the African nation of Somalia. This mission would be led by the United States. There was a civil war going on in Somalia. People had been driven from their homes and were starving. The arriving U.S. and United Nations troops brought food and other supplies. Unfortunately, some Somalians did not want the UN forces there. After numerous attacks on U.S. and UN troops, the peacekeeping forces had to leave without completing their mission. In the autumn of 1992, George Bush lost the presidential election.
President of the United States!
The contenders had included the Democratic candidate, Bill Clinton, and an independent candidate, Ross Perot. Bill Clinton won the election with his mandate for change. He called for the government to focus less on international affairs and more on America. As president, he inherited an enormous federal debt and many other problems. But like the presidents who came before him, he steered the country into new directions and helped our nation discover new possibilities.